The Real Frank Zappa book, sponsored by the Ocean Spray Beverage Corporation. Chapter 2, page 29. There goes the neighborhood. Around the age of 12, 1951 or 52, I started getting interested in the drums. I guess a lot of young boys think that the drums are exciting, but it wasn't my idea to be a rock and roll drummer or anything like that because rock and roll hadn't been invented yet. I was just interested in the sounds of things a person could beat on. I started off with orchestral percussion, learning all the rudiments, things like flams, ruffs, ratamacus, and paradiddles. I had taken a summer school group course in Monterey with a teacher named Keith McCullough. Instead of drums, he had us practicing on wooden planks. We had to stand in front of the planks and practice the rudiments used in Scottish drumming. After, I begged my parents to get me a snare drum, which I used to practice on in the garage. When they couldn't afford to rent the snare drum anymore, I started playing on the furniture, beating the paint off the bureaus and things like that. By 1956, I was playing in a high school R&B band called the Ramblers. We used to rehearse in the living room of the patio of the piano player, Stuart Congdon. His dad was a preacher. I practiced on pots and pans held between my knees like bongos. I finally talked my folks into buying a real drum set, secondhand from a guy up the street for about $50. I didn't take delivery on the drum set until a week before our first gig. Since I had never learned to coordinate my hands and feet, I was not very good keeping time with the kick drum pedal. The band leader, Elwood Jr. Madio, had gotten us a job at a place called the Uptown Hall at 40th and Meade in the Hillcrest district of San Diego. Our fee, $7 for the whole band. On the way to the gig, I realized that I'd forgotten my drumsticks, my only pair, and we had to drive back across town to get them. Eventually, I was fired because they said I played the cymbals too much. It's hard to be a drummer in training because there are very few apartments that are soundproof enough to practice in. Where did the good drummers really come from? Varese. December 22nd, 1883 to November 6, 1965. Rock and roll albums didn't appear in the marketplace until several years after rock itself was invented. In the early 50s, teenagers bought 78s or 45s. The first rock and roll album I ever saw was around 1957, Teenage Dance Party. The cover showed a group of very white teens dancing with confetti dangling all over the place near some soda bottles. Inside was a collection of songs by black doo-wah groups. Back then, my record collection consisted of 5 or 6 rhythm and blues 78 RPM singles. Since I was a lower middle class teenager, the retail price of any kind of slowly rotating hi-fi vinyl seemed entirely out of the question. One day I happened across an article about Sam Goody's record store in Look magazine, which raved about what a wonderful merchandiser he was. The writer said that Mr. Goody could sell anything, and as an example, he mentioned that he even managed to sell an album called Ionization. The article went on to say something like, "This album is nothing but drums. It's dissonant and terrible, the worst music in the world. Ah, yes, that's for me." I wondered where I could get my hands on a record like that because I was living in El Cajon, California, a little cowboy kind of town near San Diego. There was another town just over the hill called La Mesa, a bit more upscale. They had a hi-fi store. Sometime later, I was staying overnight with Dave Franken, a friend who lived in La Mesa, and we wound up going to the hi-fi place. They were having a sale on R&B singles. After shuffling through the rack and finding a couple of Joe Houston records, I made my way toward the cash register and happened to glance at the LP bin. I noticed a strange-looking black and white album cover with a guy in it who had frizzy gray hair and what looked like a mad scientist. I thought it was a great mad scientist that had finally made a record, so I picked it up, and there it was, the record with ionization on it. The author of Look article had gotten it slightly wrong. The correct title was The Complete Works of Edgar Varese, Volume 1, including ionization, among other pieces, on an obscure label called EMS, Elaine Music Store. The record number was 401. I returned the Joe Houston records and checked my pockets to see how much money I had, and I think it came out to about $3.75. I never bought an album before, but I knew that they must be expensive because mostly old people had bought them. I asked the man at the cash register how much EMS 401 would cost. That gray one in the box, he said, $5.95. Page 32. I'd been searching for that record for over a year, and I wasn't about to give up. I told him I had $3.75. He thought about it for a minute and said, "We've been using that record to demonstrate hi-fis with. Nobody's ever buys one when we use it. I guess if you want it that bad, you can have it for $3.75. I couldn't wait to hear it. My family had a genuine lo-fi record player, a Decca. It was a little box about 4 inches deep, sitting on short metal legs because the speaker was on the bottom. It had one of those clunky tone arms that you had to put a quarter on top to hold it down. It played all 3 speeds, but it never had been set to 33 1/3 before. The record player was in the corner of the living room where my mother did the ironing. When she bought it, they gave her a free record of The Little Shoemaker by some middle-aged white guy, signing group on Mercury. She used to listen to The Little Shoemaker while she was ironing, so that was the only place where I could listen to my new Varese album. I turned on the volume all the way up in order to get the maximum amount of fi, and carefully placed the all-purpose osmium tape tip needle on the lead-in spiral to ionization. I have a nice Catholic mother who likes to watch roller derby. When she heard it came out of that little speaker at the bottom of the Decca, she looked at me as if I was out of my fucking mind. It had sirens and snare drums and bass drums and a lion's roar and all kinds of strange sounds on it. She forbade me to play it in the living room ever again. I told her that I thought it was really great, and I wanted to listen to it all the way through. She told me to take the little record player into my bedroom. My mother never got to hear The Little Shoemaker again. The record player sat in my room, and I listened to EMS 401 over and over and over, pouring through the liner notes for every bit of information I could glean. I couldn't understand all the musical terms, but I memorized them anyway. All through high school, whenever people came over, I would force them to listen to Varese because I thought it was the ultimate test of their intelligence. They also thought I was out of my fucking mind. Desserts. On my 15th birthday, my mother said she would spend $5 on me, a lot of money for us then, and asked me what I wanted. I said, well, instead of buying me something, why don't you just let me make a long distance phone call? Nobody in our house had ever made a long distance phone call. I decided that I would call Edgar Varese. I decided that a person who looked like a mad scientist could only live in a place called Greenwich Village. So I called New York Information and asked if they had a listing for Edgar Varese. Sure enough, they did, and they gave me his address, 188 Sullivan Street. His wife, Louise, answered the phone. She was very sweet and told me that he wasn't there. He was in Brussels working on a composition for the World's Fair, Poème Électronique, and suggested I call back in a few weeks. I don't remember exactly what I said when I finally spoke to him. Probably something articulate like, gee, I really dig your music. Varese told me that he was working on a new piece called Deserts, which thrilled me since Lancaster, California was in a desert. When you're 15 and living in the Mojave Desert, and you find out that the world's greatest composer, who also looks like a mad scientist, is working in a secret Greenwich Village laboratory on a song about your hometown, so to speak, you can get pretty excited. I still think Deserts is about Lancaster, even if the liner notes on the Columbia LP insist it is something more philosophical. All through high school, I searched for information about Varese and his music. I found one book and a photo of him as a young man, and a quote saying he would just be as happy growing grapes as being a composer. I liked that. Stravinsky and Webern. The second 33 1/3 RPM record I bought was by Stravinsky. I found a budget line recording on Camden of the Rite of Spring, or something called the Worldwide Symphony Orchestra. Sounds pretty official, eh? The cover was a green and black abstract, whatchamacallit, and it had a magenta paper label with black lettering. I loved Stravinsky almost as much as Varese. The other composer who filled me with awe, I couldn't believe that anybody would write music like that, was Anton Webern. I heard an early recording on the Dial label with a cover by an artist named David Stone Martin. It had one or two of Webern's string quartets and his Symphony Opus 21 and the other side. I loved that record, but it was about as different from Stravinsky and Varese as you could get. I didn't know anything about 12-tone music then, but I liked the way it sounded. Since I didn't have any kind of formal training, it didn't make any difference to me if I was listening to Light and Slim or a vocal group called The Jewels, who had a song out then called Angel in My Life, or Webern or Varese or Stravinsky. To me, it was all good music. There were a few teachers in school who really helped me out. Mr. Kavelman, the band instructor at Mission Bay High, gave me the answer to one of the burning musical questions of my youth. I came to him one day with a copy of Angel in My Life, my favorite R&B tune at the time. I couldn't understand why I loved that record so much, but I figured that since he was a music teacher, maybe he knew. Parallel fourths, he concluded. He was the first person to tell me about 12-tone music. It's not that he was a fan of it, but he did mention the fact that it existed, and I am grateful to him for that. I never would have heard Webern if it hadn't been for him. Mr. Ballard was the high school music instructor at Antelope Valley High. He let me conduct the orchestra a couple of times, let me write music on the blackboard, and had the orchestra play it. Mr. Ballard also gave me a big favor without knowing it. As a drummer, I obliged to perform the gruesome task of playing in the marching band. Considering my lack of interest in football, I couldn't stand sitting around in a stupid-looking uniform going, da-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, charge! Every time somebody kicked a fucking football, freezing my nards off every weekend. Mr. Ballard threw me out of the marching band for smoking in uniform, and for that, I will be eternally grateful. My English teacher at AV was Don Gervais. He was also a good friend. Don got tired of being a teacher and quit. He wanted to be a screenwriter. In 1959, he wrote the screenplay for a super cheap cowboy movie called Run Home Slow and helped me get my first film scoring job on it. My other obsession. While other guys in high school were spending their money on cars, I spent my money on records. I didn't have a car. I went to used record outlets to buy jukebox records of rhythm and blues songs. There was a place in San Diego on the ground floor of the Maryland Hotel where you could buy R&B singles unobtainable elsewhere. All those Lightning Slim and Slim Harpo sides on the Excello label, the reason why you couldn't order them in the, quote, white person record stores, end quote, was that Excello had a policy that if a store wanted to carry their R&B line, it also had to take their gospel catalog. The only way I could get a Lightning Slim record was to travel a couple 100 miles and buy it secondhand, all scratched up. Homemade boogie. San Diego had neighborhood gangs, and each neighborhood had its own cool band, the equivalent of the home team in football. These bands competed with each other, who had the best musicianship, wardrobe, choreography. A, quote, good band, end quote, had to have at least 3 saxophones in it, one of which had to be a baritone. 2 guitar players, bass and drums. It was regarded as a more serious band if everybody wore a pink flannel 1-button roll sport coat. It was really good if they had pants to match, and it was superb if all the guys in the front row knew the same steps, and if they went up and down at the same time on the fast songs. The people who went to see these bands really loved them. These weren't rock shows put on by promoters. Instead, these were girl gangs who would rent the hall, hire the band, hang the crepe paper, and sell the tickets. The first gig I ever played, the one where I forgot my drumsticks, was sponsored by one of them, the Blue Velvets. Life in the Slow Lane. I spent one more time with Don, Captain Beefheart, Von Vallette, when I was in high school. Then after he got into show business, he dropped out during his senior year because his dad, who was a Helms-bred truck driver, had a heart attack, and Vallette, as he was known back then, took over his route for a while. Most of the time, he just stayed home from school. His girlfriend, Lori, lived in the house with him, along with his mom, Sue, his dad, Glenn, Aunt Ione, and Uncle Alan. Granny Aunt Annie lived across the street. The way Don got his stage name was Uncle Alan had the habit of exposing himself to Lori. He'd piss with the bathroom door open if she was walking by, mumble about his appendage, and say something to the along the lines of, "Ah, what a beauty! It looks like a big, fine beef heart." Don was also an R&B friend, so I'd bring my 45s over and we'd listen for hours on end to obscure hits by Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, Sonny Boy Williamson, Guitar Slim, Johnny Guitar Watson, Clarence, Gatemouth Brown, Don and Dewey, the Spaniels, the Nutmegs, the Paragons, the Orchids, the etc., etc., etc. There were piles of sweet rolls in the kitchen, like pineapple buns, that didn't sell that day. The place was crawling with starch, and we'd eat mounds of them while the records were playing. Every once in a while, Don would scream at his mother, always in a blue chenille bathrobe, "Sue, give me a Pepsi." There was nothing else to do in Lancaster. Our major form of recreation, other than listening to records, was to go for coffee in the middle of the night to the Denny's on the highway. If Don was short on cash, and this was before he took over the bread truck route, he'd open the back door of his truck, pull out one of the long drawers with the dead buns on it, and make Lori crawl through the slot into the locked cab, where she would sneak in a few bucks out of his dad's change maker. After coffee, we'd ride around in his light blue Oldsmobile with the homemade werewolf head sculpture in the steering wheel, talk about people who had large ears. Page 37. He dropped out during his senior year. All right.